to be rationalized. I will be telling you which one is the correct answer and how should you answer the different questions that we have here. So make sure that you're paying attention. All right, we start with question number 1. The process by which certain potentials are inherited from the parents for his development. And we have the choices here. Is it letter A, life, B, birth, C, heredity, D, character? Okay, now if you are trying to answer questions such as this, especially in professional education, make sure that you are reading the questions very slowly and that you are analyzing all the questions that you have. Most of the time in professional education, you can see the answer in the question itself. So here you have the terms process, okay, so it should be a process. And here in this process, the potentials are inherited from the parents to the offspring for his development. Okay, so which one do you think is the correct answer? Is it life, birth, heredity, or character? Of course, as you see, letter D cannot be our answer because we're talking about process. Character is not a process, and hence, letter D should already be eliminated. Okay, the correct answer here would be letter C. That's right. Letter C, heredity, is the correct answer for number 1. Okay, we proceed to the next one. Number 2. This theory states that there are 8 basic development stages that an individual must pass throughout his life. Is it the learning theory? Letter B, psychoanalytic theory? C, psychosocial theory? Or is it letter D, cognitive development? Okay, so again, we're looking for a theory that says that there are 8 basic development stages that an individual must pass throughout his life. The correct answer for this one would be letter C, the psychosocial theory. Okay, now psychosocial theory was actually formulated by Erik Erikson, one of the most notable theorists that we have in professional education. Okay, so these are the 8 stages of psychosocial development according to Erik Erikson. From 0 to 18 months, infant time, the infant is just learning to develop trust. Okay, so in this case, the infant is actually very fragile, very sensitive, and the infant is very dependent on the caregivers. Okay, so as caregivers, you need to be aware that 0 to 18 months, the infants are trying to develop the value of trust. Okay, so if you do not give her what she needs, then she might develop mistrust and not be able to trust people as she goes throughout her life. Now, for toddler age, there should be autonomy versus shame and doubt. Right now, I'm experiencing this with my 2-year-old kid. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and she's usually being very decisive. So whenever she wants something, should usually tell us that I want this. No, this is better. No, this is what I really want. So if your daughter, if your son is in this age, you need to be careful and you need to give them a chance to really try to practice their autonomy. Okay? So now the next stage would be preschooler age, 3 to 5 years. That's initiative versus guilt. Then grade schooler, that's industry versus inferiority. Then you have teenage years, identity versus role confusion. Then young adult life, you have intimacy versus isolation. Middle-aged adult, you have generativity versus stagnation. Then 65 years or older, you have your integrity versus despair. Now, according to Erik Erikson, if you want to become successful in the latter stages, say you want to be successful in your middle-aged adult years, you need to be successful first in the previous stages that you have. So, ang ibig sabihin po nito, hindi kayo magiging successful bilang isang middle-aged na adult pag hindi nyo na successfully pass through yung lahat ng stages bilang infant, bilang toddler, bilang preschooler. Okay, so these are the 8 stages of psychosocial development according to Erik Erikson. Now, usually, the students would find it difficult to memorize these stages. So what I usually do is to go over the different mnemonics that we have here. So I usually say the first stage, For the first stage, you say trust versus mistrust. It sounds like rusty one. Rusty one. That means first stage, trust versus mistrust. Now, the second stage would be autonomy versus shame. So try to think of it. Your mnemonic would be, a guy named Shane is riding on an automatic bike. A guy named Shane is riding on an automatic bike. That means stage 2 is autonomy versus shame. Now, stage 3, it's initiative versus guilt. That's initiative versus guilt. So, what I'm trying to use here would be a tree beside an inn with quilt. Okay, a tree beside an inn with quilt. So, that means stage 3 is initiative versus guilt. As you can see, initiative there is spelled with 2 N's because we're talking of an inn. Okay, that's an inn, I-N-N. Now, stage 4 is industry versus inferiority. Okay, so your mnemonic here would be, for big industry makes an old factory feel inferior. Okay, stage 4, industry versus inferiority. Now, we go to stage 5. Stage 5 would be identity versus role confusion. Your mnemonic here is that at 5 o'clock, the doctor gave me his identity card. Okay, at 5 o'clock, the doctor gave me his identity card, and so I was confused with my role, which means that Erik Erikson's stage 5 is identity versus role confusion. This is very crucial among teenage people, okay, among our teenagers. They need to be well aware of their roles in the society, of their identities. Now, next one, stage 6 is intimacy versus isolation. Here, our mnemonic would be, imagine an intimate sex at an isolated beach. Okay, intimate sex at an isolated beach. That means stage 6 is intimacy versus isolation. Now, stage 7 would be generativity versus stagnation. Okay, your mnemonic is, there was a blackout, and so I went to 7-Eleven to buy a generator with a stag. Okay, to buy a generator with a stag. So that means stage 7, generativity versus stagnation. And the last stage, of course, would be integrity versus despair. Stage 8, integrity versus despair. I ate a gritty pear, which made me feel despair. Okay, so again, that's stage 8, integrity versus despair. So those are the 8 basic stages according to Erik Erikson's psychosocial learning theory. Now, the rest of the choices that we had there was Freud's psychoanalytic theory. We all know who Sigmund Freud is, and according to Freud, our decisions in life are ruled by the 3 parts of our consciousness. Okay, you have the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, the id among these 3, the id is your animalistic side. The id would always want to do whatever he wants to do. He does not care about what other people would say. He does not care whether it's right or wrong. Your id is your animal side. Okay, so your id would always say, I want to do that now. Now, the opposite of your id is your superego. The superego is the moralistic side of you. So your superego would always tell the id, it's not right to do that, so don't do that. Okay, the superego would always be very cautious. Now, the ego, on the other hand, out of these 3, the ego is the balance. Okay, so the ego would always be looking for compromise. The ego would say to the id, wait, we can't do that. And the ego would also tell the superego, no, you can also do that. We should find a balance. Your ego would always be the balance between the id and the superego. So that, according to Freud, are the 3 things that would rule out, or that would rule our decisions in life. Okay, these are all part of our consciousness. Now, if you are going to be thinking of an example for your id, ego, and superego, say the let would be tomorrow, or the let would be 2 days from now, and you have a friend who has a birthday party. If you will be using the id side of yourself, if your decision will be ruled by your id, then you will not be thinking about your exams. You'd say, that's fine. I won't be thinking about my exams. I'll go party tonight. Okay, so the id, as you can see here, the id would just be partying. Okay, the id does not really care about what tomorrow would bring. Now, if you are going to be ruled out by the opposite side, which is the superego, then the superego would say, I will not go to the party. It's not right for me to go to the party since the let is coming up. So I'll not go to the party, I'll just study. I won't even eat, I'll just study and study and study. I won't even sleep. Okay, so the superego and the id are two extremes. The ego, on the other hand, that's the balance. So the ego would say, I should compromise. So I'll go to the party, but maybe I'll just eat dinner or say hi to my friends. Then after that, I'll go home and take some rest because, as you know, the let is coming up soon. Okay, so that's the id, the superego. Both of them are extremes. And the ego, of course, that's the balance. So those are the three parts of Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Now, you also have the learning theory of Piaget, Piaget's cognitive stages of development theory. There's 4 stages here. So the first stage would be called the sensory motor stage. The second stage is pre-operational stage. Then you have stage 3, concrete operational, and of course you have stage 4, which is formal operational. Now usually I'd use the mnemonics smart, people, cook, fish. As you can see, the abbreviations, it's S, smart, then P as in people, then C as in cook, then you have letter F, fish. So I'd say smart, people, cook, fish. And those would stand for the different parts of these cognitive stages of development according to Jean Piaget. Now we go over the different stages one by one. The first stage, of course, that we have there is the sensory motor stage. That's from birth to 2 years old. Now, some important details about the child during the child's development at this stage is that the child is very busy using her senses, her reflexes. So as you can see, the child has actually a lot of reflexes that, like for example, the child has the sucking reflex. Anything that the child holds, the child will just grab and put them into his or her mouth and suck on them. Okay, so that's the sucking reflex by the child. Meron din po tayong tinatawag na moro reflex. Yung moro reflex naman, yung pag nagulat yung bata ay magsi-stretch out siya ng kanyang hands and then she or he would curl up. That's the motor reflex. Okay, so these are some of the different reflexes that a child can have. So again, your child during this stage is very busy using her senses and her reflexes. So what you can do to help to try to develop the intelligence of the child, to try to develop the intelligence of your baby, is that you should give her or him a rich environment. So by rich environment, I'm not trying to say that you should be mayaman. What I'm trying to say is your environment should have a lot of stimulants. That's why sa crib po ng mga anak nyo, kung napapansin nyo, ay naglalagay kayo ng mga mobile. Yung mobile po, yung mga tumutunog-tunog, yung may mga different shapes, yung may mga different colors, because these things are actually acting as stimulants. So they try to stimulate the senses and also the reflexes of your child. So again, in your sensory motor stage, the child is very busy, very eagerly learning about his or her environment through the senses. Now, meron din pong very important part here which we call stranger anxiety. Stranger anxiety naman po, yung anak nyo ay palaging iiyak pag nakakita ng stranger. Or if you'd want your friend to hold your baby, the baby would usually cry. Okay, so hindi ito dahil hindi na sana yung anak mo na lumabas ng bahay. It's not the reason behind that. The reason is that during this stage talaga, the child would experience stranger anxiety. Okay, so very anxious siya, very scared siya of people whose faces are not familiar to the child. Now, the last step here that we have would be object permanence. Now, object permanence is actually acquired after the 6th month of the child. So, yung object permanence, pag wala pang object permanence yung child, pag hindi ka niya nakikita, hindi siya iiyak because whatever it is that he or she does not see, in the child's mind, that thing or that person does not really exist. So, walang pagka-miss. Wala pa siyang feeling ng namimiss ka niya kasi nga hindi siya aware na nag-e-exist ka pag hindi ka niya nakikita. Okay? So, out of sight, out of mind, yung sinasabi natin for object permanence. Pero once na na-establish na nung child yung object permanence, alam na niya, for example, in this picture, alam na niya na kahit na tinakpan niya nung blanket yung toy niya, once she removes the blanket, the toy would be there. Okay, so that's object permanence. So during this time, when you say bye to the baby, for example, the baby would already start crying. Dahil yung baby ay nakapag-establish na ng object permanence. She already knows that her mom exists. There is a certain person that she calls her mom. And when that person is out of her sight, then she'd say, where's my mom? She'll start looking for her mom because she already has object permanence. So these three are actually very outstanding characteristics of a child at the sensory motor stage. Now we go to the next stage, which is the pre-operational stage. The second stage here, which we call the pre-operational stage, meron siyang iba't ibang characteristic yung anak mo. The first one would be egocentrism. The child is only able to consider things from their own point of view and imagine that everyone shares this view. Now, this egocentrism, this theory, or this concept was proven by Piaget when he had this test. Okay, this was called Piaget's 3 mountains egocentrism test. So the child was placed opposite the doll. Okay, and from the side of the child, nakikita niya isang bundok lang. But from the side of the doll can actually be able to view all 3 mountains. And then the child was asked to draw what the doll can see. Okay, so the psychologist, Piaget said, or Piaget asked the child, can you draw? Pwede mo bang i-drawing kung ano nakikita nung manika? And the child has only drawn 1 mountain because that's what he can see. So in this case, in the concept of egocentrism, the child thinks that whatever it is that he perceives, whatever it is that he thinks, that he sees, this is also true for all of the people. So, kung anong nakikita niya, feeling niya, yan din yung nakikita ng iba pang tao. So, that's egocentrism. So, during this stage, your pre-operational stage, the child is actually very selfish. Okay, palagi siyang selfish. Or the child would say, no, yesterday, the one I told you yesterday, or yung ginawa ko kahapon. So, ikaw, dahil busy ka, dahil marami kang ginagawa, nakalimutan mo na kung ano yon. But the child would insist that you know what she's talking about, or that you know what he's talking about. Because he thinks that what he's thinking is also what you're thinking about. Okay, so that's egocentrism. Now, the second part that we have here is centration. Centration is the opposite of conservation. Ang sinasabing centration is that yung child ay may tendency to focus on only one aspect of the situation. Nakafocus lang siya sa isang bahagi ng isang bagay. Okay, so the child cannot see the totality of the object, the totality of a situation. I'm going to give you several examples in the next slide. Now, the next one would be animism. Sa animism naman, kinakausap nung child yung mga inanimate objects like yung electric fan, kakausapin niya, or yung pintuan, kakausapin niya, or minsan pag na-bump siya sa wall, ay susuntukin din niya yung wall dahil feeling niya yung wall is also animated, yung wall is also living, or the fan is also living. Okay, so that's animism. We all went through this. Okay, so lahat tayo kinausap yung wall, kinausap yung fan, kinausap yung pintuan. Okay, so it's very natural for us to do this at the pre-operational stage. Walang kaso doon. Okay, so now the last part would be symbolic play. For symbolic play, the child's imagination is very rich. This is the part where you were wearing a cape, nilalagay mo yung blanket mo, ginagawa mong kapa, at sasabihin mo, ikaw si Miss Universe, or minsan, you'll wear a cape and you are going to jump out of the window because you'll say that you're Superman or that you're Wonder Woman. Okay, so that's symbolic play. You pretend to be something that you're not, or to be someone that you're not. Your imagination runs very wild. Okay, so these are the parts of your pre-operational stage, they're actually all very fun. Okay? Sarap pong maging bata. Lahat ng ito ay napagdaanan natin. Okay, so talking about centration and conservation, sinasabi ko kanina, pag yung child ay nasa pre-operational stage, yung sinasabi natin kanina pre-operational stage, at yung child ay meron pang centration, nakafocus lang siya sa isang bahagi ng isang bagay. For example, if you have 2 equal glasses of liquid, okay, equal po yung amount of liquid inside these glasses, and when you pour one of the liquid or one of the contents of these glasses into a taller, narrower glass, and you ask the child kung saan dito yung mas maraming laman. Okay? A child in his pre-operational stage would say that the taller, narrower glass has more content, that the taller, narrower glass has more liquid inside it. Okay? Kasi yung focus niya ay nasa isang aspect lang ng glass, in this case, in the height of the glass. Okay, so hindi niya kino-consider whether mas manipis siya, narrower siya, hindi siya kasing lapad ng isang glass na to. Okay, so that's centration. Ito yung tinatawag nating centration. Or ito yung time na pag meron kang dalawang anak, for example, yung isa grade 6, yung isa naman 2 years old. Okay, so 2 years old, 3 years old, nasa pre-operational stage pa yung isa, nasa centration pa. When you give them choices, for example, meron kang 5 piso na tig-piso. Okay, so 5 pieces yon ng piso, so 5 pesos lahat. At saka meron kang 2 pieces ng 5 peso coins. Okay, so that makes it a total of 10. Pag pinapili mo yung child in a pre-operational stage, which one would the child choose? In the pre-operational stage, the child would choose the 5 pesos na tig-piso. Dahil para sa kanya, mas marami yon. Okay, so the child does not really know the concept of value. The child does not know the concept na yung 5 peso coin would have a bigger value than your peso coin. Okay, so this is centration. This is the child at its pre-operational stage. Okay, now, the next stage that we have would be your concrete operational stage. Now, nasa school na yung bata during this time, no? That's already at age 7 until 12 years old. So, some important characteristics of the child here would be, first, reversibility, awareness that actions and operations can be reversed. Now, prior to this, if the child has not reached the concrete operational stage yet, hindi pa alam ng bata kung paano mag-subtract. Hindi alam ng bata na, yung subtraction pala is the opposite of addition. So, hindi niya alam na if you have a clay, for example, and when you roll it into a ball, hindi niya alam na pwede mo pa siyang ibalik into a flat clay. Okay, so the child is not really aware of all these things yet. But once the child has already reached the concrete operational stage, alam na nung bata na from the clay na flat, pag niroll mo siya into a ball, later on, if you decide to put it into its flat form again, then you can do so. You can just reverse it. At marunong yung anak nyo during this stage, marunong na silang mag-deduct, marunong na silang mag-subtract. Alam na nila na subtraction is the opposite of addition. Okay, so that's reversibility. Now, kanina, pinag-usapan natin sa pre-operational stage na yung bata ay may centration. Nakafocus lang siya sa isang aspect, isang part ng isang bagay. When the child reaches the concrete operational stage, ay meron na siyang conservation. Alam na niya na pag meron kang 2 baso, for example, and you pour the contents of one of these into a taller, narrower glass, pareho pa rin yung amount nila. The child in this case will not say that the taller, narrower glass has more water in it. Dahil alam na ng child na taller nga siya, narrower nga siya, so narrower nga siya, so makipot nga siya. So that means the child does not just center his focus, his attention on one part, one aspect of an object. Pero nako-consider na niya lahat ng bahagi ng isang bagay. Okay, so that's conservation or decentration. Now, the last part would be seriation. Ang seriation naman po, nakaka-form na ng series yung isang bata. So, na-arrange na niya yung object from smallest to biggest. Na-arrange na niya yung objects from shortest to longest. Okay, so the child can already form series, that's seriation. And of course, the last stage for Piaget's cognitive development theory would be formal operational. Okay, so formal operational naman, higher thinking na yung, nasa higher level of thinking na yung bata. So, meron na siyang logic, meron na siyang abstract thinking, marunong na siyang mag-solve ng problems. Okay, so the last stage for Piaget's cognitive development would be formal operational stage. Okay, now we go to number 3. Number 3's question is, this is the transition age where rapid physical changes and sexual maturity occur, resulting in changes in feelings, thinking, and acting. Okay, what do you think is the correct answer? Is it A, puberty, B, adolescence, C, early adulthood, or D, stage 5? Okay, of course, as you can see, out of our choices here, yung stage 5 should already be eliminated. Hindi natin alam kung anong stage tong stage 5 na to. Okay, so you are just down to these 3 choices. Now, according to your question, transition age siya. Rapid physical changes and sexual maturity. So, of course, you also cannot choose early adulthood. Okay? By the time that you have reached early adulthood, tapos na yung rapid physical changes mo, hindi ka na nag-grow. Diba? Hindi ka na nag-change, nagmamature sexually. Tapos na yung sexual maturity na tinatawag. So, your 2 probable answers here would just be puberty and adolescence. But the correct answer for this one would be letter B. That's adolescence. Now, why adolescence? Let's go to the next slide for us to go over the answer that we have here. Ang pagkakaiba po kasi ng adolescence and ng puberty is that adolescence is the age. Okay, so adolescence is the transition age. Adolescence begins with puberty. Yung puberty mo ay sexual maturation lamang. Pero yung adolescence, those are the ages of your physical development. So, puberty can vary. Ang puberty sa mga babae ay maaaring mag-start earlier than 11 years. Sa mga lalaki naman ay 13 years. Pero yung adolescence, that's the transition age. So, nasa age siya. Ang puberty naman is sexual maturation. So, going back to our question, the question says transition age. That's why your choice should be letter B, adolescence. Now, I have just placed a few fun pictures here when this became a fad a few years ago no, on Facebook. So, it says the puberty challenge. Okay, so as you can see, this person here has changed from this pre-puberty to this post-puberty or during puberty. So there can be a lot of changes in our body during the puberty. Okay, so we develop or we sexually mature. Okay, so these are other examples of puberty challenge on Facebook. So neneng nene pa dito, pre-puberty. And once you hit puberty, then you have matured sexually. You have undergone physical changes. Okay, now this is another example. So as you can see, puberty has done her really well. Okay, gumanda siya. And this is another example. This actually was a picture of, these are pictures of, I forgot the person's name, but this was a contestant in Showtime. Sa Showtime siya dati, no? Tawag ng tanghalan, si Mariko ba? Mariko ba yan yung pangalan? So this was 13 years old. 13 years old, binata pa siya, no? Binatilyo. And once she has hit puberty, naging nene siya. Okay, so these are just fun pictures that we have here. Alright, now we go to number 4. This is modifying an existing scheme after an individual's interaction with the environment. Okay, modifying an existing scheme after an individual's interaction with the environment, resulting in the creation of a new scheme. Okay, so what do you think is the correct answer here? Is it assimilation, integration, is it recognition, or is it accommodation? Okay, so let's try to take a look at what the correct answer is in here. The correct answer here would be accommodation. Okay, so ang sinasabi dito, modifying an existing scheme after an individual's interaction with the environment. Now let me just explain why the answer would be accommodation. Now, this was also based on Piaget's theory. So according to Piaget, may three concepts siyang binigay sa atin. The first one would be the schema. The schema is a concept of framework or framework that organizes and interprets information. So schema, kumbaga yung pag sinabi mong schema, these are the file cabinets in our brain. Okay, so these are your concepts about certain things. That's your schema about a certain thing. Pag sinabi mong assimilation, you see the two S's that we have here. The two S's here for assimilation, I usually just tell my students to think of this as the same schema. 2S, same schema. Pareho pa rin yung iyong schema. Pareho pa rin yung iyong concept about a certain thing. Okay, so you interpret your new experience in terms of the same schema that you have. But when you say accommodation, nakikita mo yung C at C dito. Accommodation here would mean a change in schema. Okay, nag-change, naging different yung schema mo, yung concept mo about a certain thing. So when you say accommodation, you are revising your understanding to incorporate new information, na change ang schema mo about a certain thing. So going back to our question, the question said, you have modified an existing scheme or schema. Okay, so that's why our answer here would be accommodation. Again, accommodation is changing your scheme, changing your schema. Now, say, I am going to give you some examples. Say, if someone would tell you fashion model, or someone would say the words fashion model, your schema would be these looks. Okay, ang schema mo ng isang fashion model would be someone very pretty, someone very sexy, very slim, very tall. For example, Liza Soberano. Okay, that's your schema of a fashion model. Okay, so that's your schema. But, so if someone would say that this girl is actually a model, pag hindi siya nag-fit sa schema mo, and you are trying to still undergo the process of assimilation, the same schema, you'd say, no, hindi siya model, hindi siya fashion model, hindi siya pwede maging model because she has a skin defect. Okay? Meron siyang skin disease. So this girl cannot be a fashion model. That's because you are going through assimilation. The same pa rin yung schema mo of what a fashion model should be. If someone would tell you that this girl is a fashion model, if you are still in the process of assimilation, then you'd say, no, this girl cannot be a fashion model because your schema of a fashion model is someone who's perfect physically. Okay, and as you can see, this girl actually has Down syndrome. Okay, so you can say, she's not perfect. She does not look perfect in my eyes. Hence, I say that she is not a fashion model. That means nasa the same schema ka pa rin. You're still having the process of assimilation. If someone would tell you that this girl is a fashion model, you'd say, no, she's not a fashion model because fashion models should be thin. Fashion models should be skinny. Okay? So, nasa assimilation stage ka pa rin nun. Nasa assimilation processing ka pa rin nun. The same pa rin yung schema mo of what a fashion model can be. Okay? But once your thoughts, your thinking would change and would accept that these three other people can become fashion models, then that would already be accommodation. Nag-change na yung concept mo of what a fashion model can be. Now, the typical questions in the LEP based on these examples, ang assimilation and accommodation mo would be, the question usually sa LEP is, there was a child and the child saw a cat, but the child does not know what a cat is, and the child started to call the cat doggy. Okay, so tawag niya sa cat is dog. So when that happens, you can say that the child is still in the assimilation stage. Nasa assimilation stage pa siya. The same pa ang schema niya. For him, all four-legged animals are dogs. Okay, so wala pa siyang concept ng cat. Now, once the child is able to call the cat a cat, is able to stop calling the cat doggy, and has already known that a cat, although also four-legged, is different from a dog, then you'd say that that's already accommodation. The child's schema has already changed. Okay, so that's already accommodation. Okay, now we go to the next question that we have. Number 5, this is the theory that states that a person's behavior can be motivated by urges towards self-satisfaction. Is it letter A, psychoanalytic theory? Letter B, cognitive development theory? Letter C, psychosocial theory? Or letter D, moral development theory? Now, as you know, psychoanalytic theory was by Sigmund Freud. Cognitive development theory, of course, is by Jean Piaget. Your psychosocial theory, we've already discussed that. That's by Erik Erikson. And moral development theory is by Kohlberg. Okay, now what do you think is the correct answer here? In this case, your answer is theory that states that a person's behavior is motivated by urges towards self-satisfaction. Self-satisfaction, your answer would be psychoanalytic theory. Okay, your answer is psychoanalytic theory according to Freud. Now, let's go over the different theories that we have here. Now, we've already talked about Freud's psychoanalytic theory as the id, the ego, and the superego. So, we said a while ago, yung id natin is the animalistic side of us. Okay, so the id does not really care about what will happen in the future. The id would always say, bahala na si Batman, okay? I don't really care. I'll do whatever it is that I do. Even if I have a boyfriend, if I feel like kissing this person, then I'd kiss the person, okay? So that's the id side of yourself. The superego, the one at the bottom here, that's the conscious mind. That's the conscience. So, konsyensya mo siya, moral principle, moralistic side mo to. So, the superego said, no, I shouldn't be talking with any other guy because I have a boyfriend. Okay, so napaka-moralistic ng superego. But the ego on the other hand, the one in the middle, that's the part of the conscious mind which strives to balance everything. Okay, so it balances everything. It seeks to find a compromise between the id and the superego. Okay, so if you are using the ego, then you find the balance between your id and your superego. You'd say, I can talk to him, although he's a boy. I can talk to him, although I have a boyfriend, because there's nothing wrong with that. As long as hindi ako makikipaglandian sa lalaking ito, as long as I don't kiss him, I don't follow my id, then that's fine. Okay, so that's the concept of the ego. That's the balance between the id and the superego. Now we go to question number 6. This is the ability of a child to conceptualize the retention and preservation of the same quantity under various changes. We've already talked about this a while ago. What is this? What's the answer to this? The ability of a child to conceptualize retention and preservation of the same quantity. The correct answer here would be conservation. Okay, so conservation. Even if you have poured the contents of the other glass into a narrower, taller glass, alam na ng bata na equal lang yung amount of water in those two glasses. That's conservation. Alright, we go to the next one. The next one, number 7. It refers to the idea that no two individuals are the same or alike. Okay, refers to the idea that no two individuals are the same or alike. Is this your cognitive theory, exclusivity theory, individual differences, or emotional quotient? Okay, this is very easy. The correct answer here would be individual differences. Even if they are twins, kahit nakambal, ay not alike totally. Meron pa rin pagkakaiba sa kanila. May maaaring pagkakaiba sa ugali, maaaring pagkakaiba sa some aspects of their personality, maaaring pagkakaiba sa mental capacity nila. So, no two individuals are the same or are alike. This is your individual differences. Now, this is a concept that is very important among teachers. Pag teacher tayo, dapat alam mo yung individual differences na tinatawag. You should know and you should be aware that your students actually learn in different ways, and they have their own or they have their different paces of learning. So hindi po pwedeng nakatuod lang yung pansin mo, yung attention mo sa mga fast learners mo or sa mga estudyante mong mabilis na mag-catch up. You should also make sure that you give ample chances, ample activities, and accommodate the needs of those people who are slower or those people who cannot grasp the concepts faster than the rest of them are. So that's the theory of individual differences. Okay, so as teachers, you should be aware of individual differences of your students. Okay, now we go to question number 8. For question number 8, you have this question. He is known as the father of the modern IQ test. Is it Louis Terman? Is it Erik Erikson? Is it Lawrence Kohlberg? Or is it Martin Lisley? Okay, so sino kaya yung answer natin dito out of these 4 theorists that we have? The correct answer here would be letter A. That's Louis Terman. Okay, so Louis Terman is called the father of the modern IQ test. So, ito yung IQ test ni Terman. He actually used Binet's research to construct the modern-day IQ test called the Stanford-Binet test. Okay, so IQ is actually solved by using the formula mental age divided by chronological age times 100. So whatever is the mental capacity, the mental age of the child, divided by the actual age of the child times 100. That is the formula for IQ. Okay, so actually, isa sa mga pinakakilalang geniuses that we have, Einstein's IQ is 160 plus. Okay, so average would be around 90. 90% would be average. So we all hope that we have this. If you have more than that, then that's already above average, high intelligence, and so on. So, nakikita nyo, sobra-sobra na si Lolo Einstein natin. Nandito na siya sa 160. Okay, we go to the next slide. This is question number 9. Intellectual appreciative experience is, okay, your correct answer here would be based on the premise that all learning has emotional correlates. Ang question natin dito, sinasabi intellectual appreciative experience. You cannot appreciate something intellectually hanggang hindi mo siya na-enjoy, which is actually true in cases of sa mga subjects natin na medyo mahirap, no, in cases of, say, math, for example, your math, the subject math, you won't learn to learn or to really love to learn math unless you appreciate the beauty of math, unless you start getting the fun that you get from computations, from problem solving. Hanggang hindi mo na enjoy ang math, you cannot really truly enjoy learning it. Okay, so usually we'd say math is a teacher-based subject, no? Malilearn mo siya to love pag na-enjoy mo siya. So dapat talaga habang maaga pa, habang bata pa yung mga anak nyo, ay pinapapractice nyo ng math, yung mga simpleng skills lang, like maybe adding up his toys or fixing his toys, arranging them from smallest to biggest, the series, pagsiseriation, these are already math skills. So as soon as you learn to appreciate a certain subject, like math, for example, a difficult subject at that, then you'd learn to enjoy learning it. Okay, now number 10. At the early learning stage, children consider parents and teachers as authorities and models. What should they do then? What should you do as a teacher or as a parent, since you are looked upon by your kids as authorities and models? Is it letter A, parents and teachers should always coordinate children's activities? B, parents should enforce strict discipline at home and teachers in school? Letter C, parents and teachers should always be the role models. Letter D, parents and teachers should always consult each other with regards to the child's intellectual development. So, the question, this one here says, anong dapat mong gawin since kino-consider kang model ng iyong anak? And the correct answer here would be, parents and teachers should always be the role models. Okay, so that's why around our kids, around our students, we should be very careful and we should be very cautious with the way we act because, of course, the kids are very absorbent. They can easily imbibe whatever it is that we show them. Okay, so sometimes, for example, nagmumura ka lagi, you don't really teach your child directly kung paano magmura, and then one day, nagulat ka na lang, narinig mo siya magmura. And tapos nagalit ka, sabihin mo, ano sinabi mo? Kanino mo natutunan yan? Okay, and then the child would just look at you. So just be careful when you are around your kids, when you are around your young students, because they are very absorbent. They can imbibe everything that you try to show them and even the words that you speak in front of them. Okay, so number 10 would be letter C. Now we go to 11. Yes, before we go to that, as you can see here on this slide, this is what we said a while ago now, children see, children do. So kung anong nakikita ng bata, ng mga anak nyo, ay gagawin din yan. No? So usually at this age, sasabihin lagi ng anak mo sa'yo, mommy, whatever you're doing, I also want to do. Yung anak ko, if she sees me working on my laptop, my child would say, I also want to work. Okay, I also want to do this. I also want to wear the shoes that you're wearing. I also want to put on makeup or put on lipstick kasi may lipstick ka din. Okay, so children see, children do. Now we go to the next question, number 11. This is any change in the behavior of an individual. The correct answer here would be any change in the behavior of an individual. We call this learning. Okay, so this is based on the theory of your behaviorists. Sabi ng mga behaviorists natin, learning is any change in the behavior of an individual. So correct answer for number 11 would be letter A, learning. Next one, number 12. Which of the following principles is not considered under classical conditioning by Ivan Pavlov? Is it excitation, B, adhesive principle, letter C, stimulus generalization, or letter D, discrimination? Now, the correct answer here would be letter B, adhesive principle. Now, be careful when you are reading a question and you see the word not. Okay, so most of the time, the students would pick the wrong answer because they did not really pay close attention to the word not. Be careful if there is the word not, then make sure that you're thinking of the wrong choice that you need to pick. Okay, so in this case here, that would be adhesive principle. Now, let me just explain classical conditioning according to Pavlov. Maaring you can still remember Pavlov's dog. Okay, so sabi ni Pavlov, you can actually condition, you can actually teach a person how to behave by trying to conditioning the mentality, the actions of that person. So, in the case of Pavlov, gumamit siya ng dog, no? So, each time na bibigyan mo yung dog ng pagkain, of course, maglalaway ang dog. When Pavlov would ring the bell, walang reaction yung dog. Hindi naman pagkain yung bell kasi, no? So, no reaction yung dog. So, what he did was that he paired the bell to the food. Okay? So, every time that he would give the food to the dog, magri-ring siya ng bell. Okay? So, until such time na na-associate na nung dog yung ringing ng bell sa pagkain. So, next time, pag niring na ni Pavlov yung bell, kahit na walang pagkain, maglalaway na ang dog. Okay? Dahil associated na yung bell na to sa pagkain. Kasi nga every time na binibigyan siya ng pagkain, ay pinaparing itong bell. Okay? So that's classical conditioning according to Pavlov. Now, these are some processes in classical conditioning. Ang tinatawag mong generalization. If you have generalized something, that means hindi mo nadidiscriminate, hindi mo nakikita kung anong pagkakaiba nila. So, the usual question in the left here would be, as a young child, you were bitten by a dog. Okay, so nung bata ka, kinagat ka ng dog. As an adult, you developed a phobia. Okay, so nagka-phobia ka sa lahat ng klase ng dog. When you say generalization, that means kahit anong cute ng dog, ay takot ka pa rin. Okay, so that's generalization. You have generalized all kinds of stimuli. Now, the opposite of this would be discrimination. Ang discrimination naman, alam mo na, I would only be scared of the dog if the dog is a wild dog, if a dog is a crazy dog, or pag askal siya na nasa kalye, hindi nakatali, naglalaway, nakikita kong naglalaway, at parang kakagatin ako, matatakot ako. Pero, pag cute ang dog, nasa pen lang niya, nasa cage, nasa leash, hawak na may-ari, for example, then you discriminate na you don't really need to be scared of this dog. Okay, so that concept is discrimination. So, generalization and discrimination are actually opposite. Okay, so opposite yung discrimination mo and generalization. So, generalization mo, sa lahat ng klaseng dog ay takot ka. Sa discrimination naman, alam mo kung saan klaseng dog ka lang kailangan matakot. Sa ibang dog, hindi mo kailangan matakot. That's discrimination. Now, ang extinction naman ay opposite ng excitation. Ang opposite nito ay tinatawag na excitation. Ang excitation is when you start having a certain response to a new stimulus. Okay, so the first time that you have exhibited that response, you'd call it excitation. Tapos, pag nawala na yung response mo na yon, ang tinatawag mo doon would be extinction. Okay, so they're also opposite, excitation and extinction. Excitation is the first time that you have that response to a certain stimulus. Extinction naman ay ang pagkawala ng response mo in that stimulus. Now, tandaan po natin, whenever you talk about classical conditioning, whenever you talk about Pavlov, you need to remember the term phobia. So, if you see questions in the LEP about phobia, about trauma, then your answer would be Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning. Phobia or trauma, that would be Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning. Now, the common questions in the LEP about this would be, you are scared of going to the dentist's office or the dentist's clinic because as a child, you had a bad experience at the dentist's clinic. Okay, and the question would be, what theory is shown in the example? Your answer then would be classical conditioning by Ivan Pavlov. Basta may question about phobia, about trauma, then your answer would be classical conditioning by Ivan Pavlov. Okay, so that's for number 12. Now we go to number 13. This is the reinforcement of a person's responses by presentation or removal of reward and punishment. Now, the tips that you have here, the hints that you have here would be the terms reward and punishment. This is still part of your behaviorism. Is it operant conditioning? Operant conditioning is by B.F. Skinner, Boris Frederick Skinner. Transfer of learning. Is it a feedback principle? Is it discipline? The correct answer here would be letter A, operant conditioning. Operant conditioning by B.F. Skinner. Now, tingnan naman natin kung ano itong operant conditioning ni Skinner. Whenever you see the terms reinforcement, punishment, feedback, then that's going to be B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. I hope you have your notepad. I hope you have your notebook where you can write all the things that I'm talking about. These things are all very helpful when you go take your LEP in March or in September. So make sure that you're paying close attention to what I'm trying to tell you. So again, when you see the terms reinforcement, punishment, feedback, even computer-aided instruction or your CAI, reinforcement, punishment, feedback, computer-aided instruction, these are all under B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. Kay Ivan Pavlov, a while ago, I've said that whenever you see the terms phobia, trauma, that's classical conditioning by Ivan Pavlov. In this case, reinforcement, punishment, feedback, computer-aided instruction, that's for B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. Now, ano naman yung transfer of learning? Ang transfer of learning, it says here, the application of skills, knowledge, and or attitudes that were learned in one situation to another learning situation. So, you can actually have a transfer of learning pag may identical elements yung dalawang experience na to. Kung this element has the same or identical elements as the same experience that you have here, then you can actually transfer your learning. Now, in present-day education, we call transfer of learning application. Okay, another term for transfer of learning would be application. All right, we go to the next slide. Ano naman ang feedback? Feedback is giving your comments, giving your suggestions to someone or to a student, for example, about a certain quiz. Okay, so we need to remember that whenever we're giving the quiz and we want to give the feedback, it should be ASAP. It should be as soon as possible. Okay, now focus on the positive. It should be something that is given privately. So do not give it in public. Focus on behaviors that can be changed, not on personality traits, because of course your personality traits are very difficult to change. Okay, so that's effective feedback. Now, discipline naman, you know the meaning of the term discipline. It is defined as training or molding of the mind and character to bring about desired behaviors. So, tinitrain mo someone to become a better individual, to have better or to have desired behaviors. That's disciplina. So, that's why one advice that I can give you is if you have kids, as early as you can, dapat dinidisiplina na sila dahil nga pag sinasabi natin, pag malaki na yung sungay, ay mahirap nang putulin. No? So, bata pa lang, dapat you try to discipline your child or you start disciplining your child if, or while your child is still very young. Okay, question number 14. This stimulation of action best explains the behavior of an individual to take what he perceives to be the shortest route or route in his goal. Is it recognition, assimilation, response, or motivation? Again, this is stimulation of action. These are also your tips there. Okay, stimulation of action that explains behavior of an individual to take what he perceives to be the shortest route in his goal. The correct answer here would be motivation. Okay, motivation is a stimulation of action. That's why it's very important for us to, as teachers, it's very important for us to always motivate our kids, motivate our students to learn. That's why meron tayong tinatawag na motivation at the beginning of any class period that we have. Okay, so you motivate them, stimulate them to take action or to start learning. All right, question number 15. This is the process by which an individual acquires the social and cultural heritage of the society where he belongs. Okay, is it socialization, internalization, integration, or acquisition? The correct answer for this one would be socialization. Okay, socialization is the correct answer here. The individual acquires the social and cultural heritage of the society. Now, socialization is the process of learning to behave in a way that is acceptable in your society. Ito yung dinidikta ng ating society, no? So, it is acceptable, for example, for a woman to act ladylike. Diba? Yung sinasabi natin, pag babae ka, dapat ladylike ka, dapat prim and proper ka, dapat hindi ka galaw-gaw pag nag-move, pag gumalaw. Okay? So, now we have several agents of socialization. You can have the immediate family. Even your extended family can become a primary source or primary agent of socialization. Then, secondary agent of socialization, you have friends, peers, teachers, and even media. Okay, so as parents, it's very important for you to check social media, the social media activities of your child. Okay, so dapat tinitingnan nyo din kung anong yung mga pinapanood nila sa social media. Alright, we go to the next question that we have. Question number 16. Claustrophobia is an irrational fear of darkness, strangers, closed space, or letter D, height. Now, sa LET, lumalabas din po yung mga phobia. Okay, so it's also important for you to be aware of the different types of phobia that we have. The correct answer for this one would be C, closed space. Claustrophobia is an irrational fear of closed space. Now, these are the top 10 phobias that we have, the usuals that would come out in the LET. When I took the LET, this one po, number 4, came out. Okay, agoraphobia, the fear of open or public spaces. There is another one that's called xenophobia. Xenophobia naman is the fear of strangers. Okay, so the fear of strangers is called xenophobia. So make sure that you also take note of that. That's also one of the phobias that we have, and sometimes this would also come out in the lab. Okay, so again, these are the top 10 phobias that you have. The bonus would be your xenophobia, the fear of strangers. All right, we go to the next example, the next question, I mean. Number 17, this is the period of physical, sexual, and mental maturation, which is characterized by rapid somatic growth. Okay, so in this case here, question number 17 is asking us for the period of physical, sexual, and mental maturation. What do you think is the correct answer? Your answer here should be letter C, puberty. Okay, again, that's letter C, puberty. A while ago, we had a question, and yung answer niya was adolescence. Adolescence, again, is the transition age. But when you're talking about the period of maturation, then that's going to be puberty. Rapid somatic growth. If you don't understand the meaning of the term somatic, somatic simply means body or physical growth. Okay, so that's physical growth. Right, so the correct answer would be letter C, puberty. We go to the next question. What is the main function of the philosophies of education? Is it letter A, to aid the learner to build his own personal philosophy? Letter B, to define goals and set directions from which educational efforts should be exerted? Letter C, provide guidelines in the foundation of education policies and programs. Letter D, provide norms and standards for evaluation purposes. Okay? Now, the correct answer here would be letter B, to define goals and set directions from which educational efforts should be exerted. Okay, that's the correct answer for number 18. Why? Because when you're talking about philosophy, philosophy actually gives you direction. Okay, it gives you direction in education. Now, so when you have your philosophy, the school officials, teachers, all the stakeholders would coordinate and put their efforts toward achieving that aim of your philosophy. Okay, so it attempts to establish coherent meaning within the whole domain of thought. So again, whenever you say philosophy of education, that's the guiding principle that you have. So if someone would ask you, if you have an interview, and that person would ask you, what's your philosophy of education? That means, what is your guide in teaching? Okay, anong pinaka-basis mo when you teach students? What's your driving principle in teaching students? So that's your philosophy of education. All right, next one, next question. 19. According to Froebel, kindergarten is also known as blank. Is it A, a place where children have fun and enjoyment? Letter B, a garden where children could grow and develop. Letter C, the learning center for life. Letter D, a place where new beginnings begin. The correct answer for this one would be letter B, a garden where children could grow and develop. Now, Froebel is actually known as the father of kindergarten. So kindergarten actually came from a German term, which means garden for the children. It is a preschool educational approach, traditionally based on playing, singing, practical activities such as drawing, and social interaction as part of the transition from home to school. Okay, so that's kindergarten. That's the meaning of the term kindergarten from the father of kindergarten himself, which is Friedrich Froebel. Okay, now we go to the next slide. Which of the following statements is given emphasis by humanistic education? Is it A, the great works of man, such as the classics, should be enjoyed? Letter B, man should learn the different philosophies of education. Letter C, build a man who is distinctly civilized, educated, and refined. Letter D, develop man into a thinking individual. Now, your question is based on humanistic education. The correct answer here would be letter C, build a man who is distinctly civilized, educated, and refined. Okay, now let's take a look at the next slide to check our explanation. Okay, now humanism is an approach that believes that learning should be viewed as a personal act to fulfill one's potential. If you are a believer of humanism, then you should think of learning as the act of fulfilling your own potential. So some key proponents for this are Abraham Maslow, you have Rogers, you also have Malcolm Knowles. Okay, your key terms would be self-actualization, naririnig to na lagi natin from Abraham Maslow. Then teacher is just a facilitator. So for number 20, again, when you're talking about humanistic education, the correct answer would be build a man who is distinctly civilized, educated, and refined. Someone who has reached his full potentials. That's the tenet of humanistic education. Number 21, a teacher who advocates the pragmatic philosophy of education believes that experience should follow learning. Thus, she has to. Now, the question is about pragmatic philosophy, pragmatism. Ano ba yung pragmatism? Yung pragmatism po, sinasabi ng pragmatism na yung ituturo mo sa bata ay kailangan yung mga praktika lang. Ituturo mo sa bata ay kailangan na yung mga magagamit lang. So, if you go to a farm and you have some kind of tutorials, for example, you should not be teaching them how to fish dahil hindi din naman nila magagamit. So, instead of teaching them how to fish, you should teach them how to do farming. Diba? Dahil if you are trying to be a pragmatic, teach only what is useful to them, teach only what's going to be practical for them to learn. Okay, so that's pragmatism. So in this case, your answer would be, is it require her student mastery of the lessons? Requiring mastery, that's usually under essentialism. Okay, essentialism yung mastery of the lessons. Encourage your students to memorize facts, that's still essentialism. Equip your students with basic skills and abilities, essentialism pa rin tong term na basic. Your answer here would be to provide your students with opportunities to apply their skills and abilities. Again, pragmatism, practicality, usefulness, whatever is practical, whatever is useful. So how can you check whether something is practical, something is useful for them? It is by providing them opportunities to apply their skills and abilities. That's why your answer for number 21 is letter D. Okay, again, number 21 is letter D. Number 22, how are institutions of learning encouraged to set higher standards over and above the minimum requirement for state recognition? Now, this is found in our Constitution. Okay, this is found in our Constitution, the part for education. So what do you think is the correct answer here? How are institutions of learning encouraged to set higher standards over and above the minimum requirement? The correct answer would be through voluntary accreditation. That's why we have your PAASCO, you have your AACOP, okay, and the rest of accrediting bodies. Okay, so we have voluntary accreditation because we want the colleges, we want universities to set higher standards, higher than the minimum required by the state. Number 23. An eye defect characterized by clear vision in one dimension but unfocused vision on the other is called, is it letter A, myopia, letter B, astigmatism, letter C, hyperopia, or letter D, presbyopia? The correct answer for this one is astigmatism. Okay, so anong sinasabi ng astigmatism? Your vision is clear in one dimension but it's unfocused on the other. Okay, so this is your astigmatism. If you have a healthy eye, you can easily see all the lines clearly. Pag meron kang astigmatism, blurry yung lines. You'll know that you have astigmatism if you try to hang some clothes. For example, nagsasampay ka, and you are looking at the clothes line, tinitingnan mo yung sampayan, tapos nakikita mo yung sampayan na parang gumagalaw-galaw. Yung sampayan nagiging double, nagiging triple, nagiging quadruple. Okay? So you know that you have astigmatism. You cannot see one line clearly, hindi siya defined as one line. I myself also has astigmatism. Now, what are the rest of the terms that we have there? Yung myopia, myopia, one of the choices that we had, that means nearsightedness. When you say nearsightedness, nakakakita clearly pag ang isang bagay ay malapit. Pag malayo siya, then you cannot really see it clearly. Ang hyperopia naman ay farsightedness. Hyperopia is farsightedness. That's the opposite of nearsightedness. So, pag hyperopia naman, mas nakikita mo siya pag farsighted ka, mas nakikita mo ang isang bagay pag malayo ito. You can see it clearly if it's farther from you. If it's near, then nahihirapan kang makita ito, no? Blurry siya, blurry. Now, the last term there, presbyopia, is also called age-related farsightedness. So, ito nakikita mo to sa mga taong medyo may edad na, no? Sometimes you see them, they're reading their newspaper, naka-close bahagya yung mata, tapos yung newspaper, pinapalayo nila it is set at a farther distance from the eye, okay? Because hindi na sila nakakakita clearly pag masyadong malapit, okay? You see this in maybe your dads or your grandfathers, okay? Your presbyopia. So the answer for that question would be astigmatism. All right, next one. Number 24, which of the following statements does not apply to adolescents? Saan dito ang hindi characteristic ng isang adolescent? Adolescent, your teenage daughter, teenage kids, okay? Your teenage students. Is it letter A, they desire the approval of their peers? Again, we're trying to look for the not, okay? Which one is not a characteristic of your adolescents? They seek dependence on their parents. Letter C, they have a marked sexual development. Or letter D, they're often emotionally confused. Okay, so as teenagers, we know that we always want the approval of our peers. Our peers here, that would mean people of the same age. We know that we are sexually maturing. And we know that we are usually emotionally confused. So, para kang lukaret habang ikaw ay isang teenager, no? Konting bagay lang, napaka-emotional mo, napaka-sensitive mo. The correct answer for this one would be letter B. They seek dependence on their parents. Pag teenager ka, gusto mo lang lagi nasa labas ka ng bahay, di ba? Ayaw mong nakikita kang kasama mo yung parents mo. When you were younger, you would go to the church together with your parents. But when you become a teenager, gusto mo kasama mo na lagi yung mga barkada mo, no? So, that's the correct answer there. That would be letter B. They seek dependence on their parents. So, teenagers would always want to be free, would always want to be carefree, would always want to have the freedom, they would always want to be with their peers. Next question, 25. As young people mature, society expects them to develop competencies and assume social roles in a conventional manner. This is called expectation of parents, B, influence of peer groups, C, influence of formal education, or letter D, cultural demands. Okay, so what are some of the hints that we have here? Society expects. Okay, expectation ng society. So your correct answer here would be cultural demands. Kung ano ang demand ng ating kultura, so that's what we'd usually aim to do. Kaya yung sinasabi nga nila, nasa 20s ka na, wala ka pa ring boyfriend, 'di ba? Or late 20s ka na, early 30s ka na, wala ka pa ring anak, wala pa rin kayong anak. Okay, so these are cultural demands. Okay, mga demands na binibigay sa atin ng ating society, binibigay sa atin ng ating kultura. Number 26, the founder of the theory of psychology called psychoanalysis was Locke, Hume, Freud, or Leibniz. Okay, the psychology that is called psychoanalysis, that's of course Sigmund Freud. Okay, so that's letter C, Sigmund Freud. Freud is the answer for number 26. Now, again, we've already gone through this. Psychoanalysis is your id, your ego, and your superego. Meron pang isang theory si Freud, psychosexual theory naman. Ang sabi naman sa psychosexual theory ay may 5 stages of psychosexual development na pinagdadaanan yung isang bata. Sa kada stage na to ay may iba't ibang bahagi ng katawan na nakakapagbigay ng satisfaction sa isang bata. So 0 to 2 years old, yung satisfaction niya is through oral. Okay, so oral satisfaction. That's why the child would always be feeding, the child would always be thumb sucking, babbling, putting everything in his or her mouth. Now, when the child reaches the 2 to 3 years of age, the child undergoes the anal stage. Okay, so ang sexual satisfaction naman is through bladder control and bowel movement. Now, phallic stage naman, phallic is from the word phallus, which means genitals. So in this case, the child learns to realize the differences between males and females and becomes aware of sexuality. So during this time, nakikita mo yung anak mo, pag meron kang anak na lalaki, nasa phallic stage siya from 3 to 7 years, nakikita mo minsan pinaglalaruan niya yung kanyang ari, no, yung kanyang genitals pinaglalaruan niya. So you don't have to think na there's something wrong with your child. Don't say, ay, ano ba tong anak ko? Nakakatakot. Baka naman manyakis to. Hindi po. Wala pong problema yung anak nyo. Natural po yan. Okay? At the phallic stage, the child is becoming aware of his sexuality, of the different parts of his body, most especially. So, kaya po niya tinatouch yung different parts of his body. Now, 7 to 11, you'd call this latency. Latency po siya, meaning walang sexual desire yung bata because the child is very busy in schoolwork. Okay, so wala masyadong sexual desire ang bata dito. Now, genital, the last stage, genital age, that's from 11 years old to adulthood. Okay, so this time, we sometimes call this the sexual reawakening. Nagising ulit ang kanyang sexuality from phallic, di ba, pagpunta ng latency, medyo natulog yung sexuality mo, wala masyadong sexual activities. During the genital stage, na-reawake ang sexuality ng isang bata, but this time, hindi yung sarili niya ang tinitingnan niya, hindi yung sarili niya yung hinawakan niya, but he finds satisfaction with the opposite sex. Okay, so that's the satisfaction with the opposite sex na, that's genital stage. Now, as you can see, I have placed our mnemonic here. Owls always play late games. Owl here is for oral stage, then anal, phallic, latency, and genital stage. Okay, so owls always play late games. Yan po yung ating mnemonic for psychosexual theory according to Freud. Okay, so these are the two theories according to Freud, your psychoanalytic theory and psychosexual stages of development theory. Now, the next one that we have here is John Locke. Isa sa mga choices natin, choice letter A was John Locke. John Locke is called the father of liberalism. He is very famous for the concept of tabula rasa. Yung sinasabi natin tabula rasa, the mind of a child is a blank slate. Yan yung sinasabi ni John Locke na ang bata ay walang kamuang-muwang paglabas niya. Okay, so as a parent, as a teacher, dapat stimulate mo yung mind ng bata, binibigyan mo siya ng sense experience, kumbaga. Sensory experience. Okay, so tabula rasa, that's the blank slate of the mind according to John Locke. Now, si David Hume naman, ang nagbigay sa atin ng, isa siya sa mga proponents ng three schools of thought na to, empiricism, skepticism, and naturalism. Ang empiricism, ang belief ng empiricism is that the main source of happiness and the main source of truth would be sense experience. Okay, so dapat na-experience mo ang isang bagay so that you'll believe that it's true, so that you'll find happiness. Okay, that's empiricism. Skepticism naman, palagi kang may duda. Okay, so you'd always doubt something, whether it exists or not, you'd always be doubting it unless you experience it. Yan yung sabi ni David Hume. Then, of course, naturalism, you'd always tend to follow the natural growth that we have, the natural stages of development that we have. That's actually according to David Hume. The next one, the last choice that we have there was Leibniz. Si Leibniz naman ay isa sa mga pinaka-importanting tao sa mathematics. Okay, so Leibniz became very successful because of differential and integral calculus. Isa siya sa mga proponents ng calculus. Alright, we proceed to our next question, number 27. When the learner reaches a point where no further learning can be expected, he is in a so-called what? Is it development crisis, learning plateau, regression, or depression? A correct answer for this one would be learning plateau. Ang sinasabi dito, he has reached a point where no further learning can be expected. Hindi na siya nagle-learn dahil he has already reached his learning plateau. Maaring he has already been studying for 3 hours, 2 hours straight. So kahit anong gawin ng bata ay hindi na niya na-absorb kung anong tinuturo mo sa kanya. So as a parent, dapat din hinay-hinay tayo, especially if our students are very young, they actually have very short attention span. So hindi po pwedeng, for example, for straight 3 hours gusto mo siya mag-pay attention sa iyo, no? Hindi nila kaya. That's the learning plateau that you have. 28. Regarding the social maturation of boys and girls, teachers should bear in mind that, is it letter A, girls mature at a late stage than boys, letter B, girls mature at an earlier stage than boys, letter C, boys and girls mature at the same time, letter D, there are no marked differences in their time of maturity. Now, kung napapansin nyo po, we should eliminate choices C and D sa ating question. Bakit kamo? Why do we need to eliminate choices C and D? Choices C and D are the same. Pareho po sila. If you try to read, choice C says, boys and girls mature at the same time. At sabi naman ni D, there are no marked differences. Walang pagkakaiba. So that means at the same time nga sila nagmamature. So that leaves us just two remaining choices. Dalawa na lang yung remaining choices mo. It can either be letter A, girls mature at a late stage than boys, or it can also be letter B, girls mature at an earlier stage than boys. Now, we all know that the correct answer to this would be letter B, girls mature at an earlier stage than boys. That's why when you were in your elementary years, mas matatangkad yung mga babae. Diba? Mas matatangkad yung mga babae. I'm just talking of physical maturation here. So, earlier yung mga babae tumatangkad, mas pandak yung mga lalaki ng elementary kayo. And then, eventually, the boys would play catch-up. The boys would catch up during high school years na, no? Biglang tatangkad yung mga lalaki. Now, we also know that in our society, in our culture, the debut or sinasabi natin debut ng isang babae is at age 18. Pero yung sa lalaki is at age 21. Okay? So, sinasabing mas mature nga, nagmamature earlier yung mga babae kaysa sa mga lalaki. Number 29. Rationalization is used by a student who always gives explanation or reason for their failures rather than own their faults, like to take the blame for their faults, bribe their elders with promises, or letter D, substitute words for deeds. Now, the hint here, the very important word in your question is the term rationalization. Okay, kailan nga ba ginagamit ang rationalization? This is letter A. Okay, so a student who always gives explanation or reason for their failures rather than own their faults is using rationalization. Rationalization's root word is actually reason. Okay, so rason, palagi kang may rason. Kahit sa anong bagay, meron kang rason. That's rationalization. Okay, so rationalization here says, any view appealing to reason as a source of knowledge or justification. Okay, so that's your rationalism. All right, next one. 30. Which of the following is true of abnormal psychology? Is it letter A, it studies the cause of personality defects? Letter B, it measures the accomplishments of the individuals. Letter C, it concentrates on the scholastic performance of the individual. Letter D, it investigates the educational background of the individual. Okay, we're talking of abnormal psychology here. And of course, I think it's pretty obvious. Your answer should be letter A, it studies the cause of personality defects. Ano nga ba ang cause ng defects sa iyong personality? Okay, so this is abnormal psychology, the branch of psychology that studies unusual patterns of behavior, emotion, and thought, which may or may not be understood as precipitating a mental disorder. We go to the next question. Which of the following is a continuous variable? Is it A, weight, B, sex, C, nationality, or D, race? Okay, the correct answer for number 31 would be letter A, weight. Okay, that's letter A, weight. Ano nga bang ibig sabihin ng weight? Or ng continuous variable. Now, we have two types of variable in research. The first one is continuous variable. When you say continuous variable, it can take on any value between two specified values. Okay, so hindi siya fixed. Example dito is income and age. Okay, so you can have interval and ratio. But when you say discrete variable, it is separated from one another. Yung attribute mo is separated from one another. So very fixed siya. Hindi ka po pwedeng sa marital status mo. If someone would ask you, what's your marital status? You can't say, it's in between single and married. Okay? Because your discrete variable is fixed. It is very distinct. So you can only say either you're single or that you're married or maybe divorced or annulled or legally separated. Okay, so hindi pwedeng in between. So in this case here, continuous variable would be weight. Okay, so sometimes it can be 50 kilograms, 50.1 kilograms, 53.4 kilograms, and so on. Okay, so it's variable. Number 32, which of the following is true about one's IQ? Okay, your choices are, it remains fairly constant, it is highly changeable, it is affected by attitude, it is never constant. What do you think is your correct answer there? Now, you have some things here that are the same. Okay, if you check letter B, it is highly changeable, meaning nag-iiba-iba siya, palaging nag-iiba-iba. And letter D, it is never constant, so you cannot choose any of these two. Hindi pwedeng letter B or letter D yung choice mo dahil pareho yung sinasabi nila. Sabi ng letter B, nag-iiba-iba siya. Sabi naman ng letter D, hindi siya constant. So meaning nag-iiba-iba din siya. Is IQ affected by attitude? Okay, can that be your correct answer? Your correct answer here would be letter A. It remains fairly constant. So, ang IQ ng isang tao, kahit hindi siya mag-aral, for example, your IQ is very high, you have an IQ of 130, for example, kahit hindi ka masyadong mag-aral or kahit mag-stop ka mag-aral for several years, your IQ does not really change. Okay, your IQ, that's your mental ability. Okay, so it remains fairly constant. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, IQ is solved by using the formula mental age divided by chronological age times 100. Number 33, transfer of training easily takes place if the activities involved, we've talked about this a while ago when we had our slide on transfer of training. This can happen if there's letter B. They have identical elements. Okay, so pag may pagkakapareho yung mga elements nila, then you can have transfer of training or application, or sometimes also called transfer of learning. Alright, we go to number 34. When the learner is well motivated, he performs his task, letter A, with indifference, letter B, with disinterest, letter C, with arrogance, letter D, with enthusiasm. Pag well motivated yung student mo, which one do you think is the correct answer? All three other choices here are negative. Okay, so with indifference, walang pakialam. With disinterest, the same meaning as walang pakialam. With arrogance, may pagmamayabang. Okay, so the correct answer would be with enthusiasm. Ganadong-ganado yung student mo to learn because they were well motivated. Okay, so that's letter D, with enthusiasm. We go to number 35. A 6-year-old child who has a mental age of 8 years old has an IQ of, remember your formula for IQ would be mental age divided by chronological age, which is the actual age, times 100. Okay, the age of the child here is 6. Pero yung mental age niya is 8. So that means you divide 8 by 6. 8 divided by 6, then times 100. The correct answer here would be 133. Okay, so that's letter D, 133. That's mental age of 8 divided by 6 times 100. Number 36. The ratio obtained by dividing mental age by chronological age times 100 is called, we've just talked about this a while ago. Correct answer would be intelligence quotient or IQ. Intelligence quotient or IQ is the correct answer, letter C. Number 37. Which of the following was written by Plato? Is it Sic et Non, The School and Society, The Republic, or is it Emile? Okay, of course, we know Plato to be one of the most famous philosophers that we had, one of the most famous Greek philosophers. The correct answer would be letter C, The Republic. Okay, so this is The Republic. The Republic is a Socratic dialogue written by Plato around 380 BC concerning justice and order, the order and character of the just city-state, and the just man. So again, Plato wrote the very famous book called Republic. Sic et Non, the other choices, Sic et Non was written by Peter Abelard. The School and Society and the Child and the Curriculum was written by John Dewey, one of the most famous progressivists that we have, also called the father of progressivism. And of course, Emile, or on Education, was written by Rousseau. Okay, so Emile was a book written by Rousseau about his son. Okay, so he used his son in his scientific findings, in his scientific investigations. Next one, number 38. Who among the following below asserted that education is for complete living? Is it A, Dewey, Spencer, Kant, letter D, Froebel? The correct answer for this one is letter B, Spencer. Okay, so this is one of the most famous quote by Herbert Spencer, education is complete living. Sinabi naman ni John Dewey, education is the process of living through a continuous reconstruction of experiences. Okay, so education is a process of living through different experiences. That's by John Dewey. So the answer there would be Spencer. Ito naman yung famous quote ni Kant. All our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to the understanding, and ends with reason. There is nothing higher than reason. Okay, so Kant is one of the proponents of rationalism. The use of reasoning. Number 39. The right of an educational institution and its faculty to prescribe the methods, strategies of teaching refers to. What is this? The right of an educational institution and the faculty to prescribe the methods, strategies of teaching is academic freedom. This is usually found in our tertiary levels of education. Okay, so mga colleges, mga universities, they have what they call academic freedom. They have the choice to make their own syllabus. They can include whatever it is that they want to include there, their topic, or the different units that they can include there. That's academic freedom. Number 40. The 1987 Constitution provides that religious instruction can be given A, with the student's consent, letter B, with the parents' or guardian's approval, letter C, with mayor's permit, letter D, with the school support. Now, this is one misconception in the education system in the Philippines. So, sa basic education natin, pag tinanong mo yung isang bata, or usually I'd ask this to my LET students, if you ask them, when should you give religious training or the subject religion? So yung sinasabi usually is during lunchtime, or sometimes during a holiday, or sometimes vacant period. Okay, so one very important thing for you to note is that according to the Constitution, ang teaching of religion should be in regular school hours. So, dapat nasa regular school hours siya. Ginagawa lang siyang vacant period sa atin, or binibigay lang siya pag vacant period or pag holiday, for example, pag walang pasok, because of maybe the availability of the catechist. Okay, pero according to the Constitution, it should be within regular school hours. I'm not sure if we still have religious instruction in the Philippines right now, no? But in this case, for number 40, Ang question is when can you give religious instruction? This is also found in the Constitution, and it's with letter B, with the parents and guardians' approval only. If the guardian or the parent does not approve, then you cannot force the child to learn religion. Okay, you cannot teach the child religion. Now, there is another question in the let which is associated to this. The question is, who assigns the religious teacher in schools? Who assigns the religious teachers in schools? The correct answer there would be the church. Okay, so it's your church and it should be approved by the principal. Okay, so the church would give you your catechist, and of course, upon the approval of your principal. Number 41, public schools in the Philippines are the contribution of which colonizer? Is it letter A, American, B, British, C, Japanese, D, Spanish? Now, of course, we can just neglect letter B because we did not really have close contacts with the British during the prehistoric times. No, wala pa masyado. In our history, we don't really have a period with the British Empire in it. So your choice can be Americans, Japanese, Spanish. You should neglect Spanish because of course, yung Spanish nga, they didn't want the Indios or the Filipinos to really learn during that time. Okay? So we're asking about public schools. So hindi naging public yung education system during the Spanish time. At yung focus ng Spanish was religious instruction. So gusto lang nila is maging educated tayo in their religion. That's why a lot of us became Catholics. Sa Japanese time naman, it was the love of labor. Okay, so vocational teaching. Vocational was given important focus during the Japanese period. The correct answer here would be letter A, American. So, ang mga Amerikano talaga yung naging susi para magkaroon ng public school sa Pilipinas. Okay, so it's the Americans who gave us public school system. Number 42, hardship allowance is given to a teacher when? Okay, ano itong sinasabing hardship allowance? And this is also in our Constitution. A long time ago, your hardship allowance was only 2.5% of your monthly salary. But nowadays, I think the hardship allowance is at 25% of your monthly salary. And this is given to a teacher who is assigned in a hazardous area. So pag delikado kung saan ka nagtuturo, delikado ito, for example, nasa Tawi-Tawi ka, nasa may gera sa lugar kung saan ka nagtuturo, or mahirap puntahan yung lugar kung saan ka nagtuturo ka sa bukid. For example, I know some people who are teaching in the mountains and then they sometimes would stay there for half a month, then they would go down after half of the month that they stay there, then they'd be receiving hardship allowance. Okay, so hardship allowance again is 25% of their monthly salary. Number 43. Which of the following principles of human growth refers to the situation that girls mature earlier than boys? Is it letter A, growth follows a sequential pattern? Letter B, development rates vary? Letter C, each stage of development has characteristic traits? Letter D, maturation should precede certain type of learning? We've talked about this a while ago. We had a question that was similar to this a while ago. And I think you've all agreed that the correct answer would be letter B, development rates vary. And we said, girls mature earlier than the boys. Okay, so mas nauuna pong mag-mature ang mga girls kaysa sa mga boys. So that's letter B. Number 44, a teacher who gives uniform assignment to be worked out by all learners in arithmetic is not observing a characteristic of a good assignment. Which characteristic is overlooked? Ano yung ini-ignore mo if you are giving uniform assignment? Pare-pareho lang yung assignment mong binibigay sa iyong mga learners. Is it should be definite? It should be stimulating? It should emphasize the essential? Or is it letter D? It should provide for individual differences. I've mentioned this a while ago and I said it is very important. Your correct answer here would be letter D. It should provide for individual differences. Now, as I've mentioned earlier in this video, as I was having the live stream, I used to teach in Ateneo de Iloilo. I've also taught in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, in an international school there. I had no experience teaching in a public school. Currently, I'm teaching here in South Carolina. I'm a science teacher in Manning High School, in Manning, South Carolina. And here, napakalaking bagay sa amin dito that you know how to give individual or to give attention to individual differences. One of the challenges that I faced when I started teaching here is that here, nami-mainstream nila yung mga students with special needs. So even if a student has ADHD, even if a student has dyslexia, for example, even if a student has some behavioral problems, that student would still be found in your classroom. Okay, so I'm teaching physical science, but I have students out of my students that are, for example, if I have 25 students, 27 students or so, I have 10 or so of them with special needs. So as a teacher, you should really make sure that you accommodate their needs. Okay, so we have what we call their IEP, their individualized educational plan, at pinapirma po kami sa IEP na yon. So dapat sinusundan mo yung IEP, dahil pag hindi mo sinunod yung mga nakalagay sa IEP niya, for example, sinabi sa IEP niya na bigyan mo siya ng isang araw na extension for his work or for her work, kailangan pinapagamit mo siya ng device. Okay, so if you're not following the accommodation of a student with special need, pwede kang isu, pwede kang kasuhan, pwede kang makulong. Okay, so as teachers here, it is very important for us to know how to follow the IEP or to satisfy the individual differences of our students. So sometimes I have some students who have difficulties reading, and what I do, if I give them the test or the quiz, then I would record the quiz so that when they take it, hindi ko na kailangang ibasa pa sa kanila or basahin pa sa kanila. Kailangan na lang pakinggan nila yung recording. Okay, so as teachers, again, it's very important for you to note the individual differences of your students. Number 45, if a student asks a question which the teacher does not have a ready answer, the latter should. What if you are having a class discussion and suddenly you have a child who's very smart, or you have a child who's just curious, and the child asks you a question and you don't know the answer to the question? What would you do? Is it letter A, dismiss the question as irrelevant? You tell them, don't talk to me or don't ask me about some things like this because that's irrelevant. Okay, hindi importante yung tinatanong mo. Is it to offer a bluff or to just say anything that you'd want to say, even if you're not sure of it? Letter C, admit the fact that he doesn't know the answer and research on it. Or letter D, ask volunteers to answer the question. The correct answer for this one would be letter C. As teachers, dapat din you should be comfortable enough to say that you don't know everything. Okay? Because sometimes our students would think that we are very smart, we know everything that the world has to offer, but of course that is not true. No one is perfect and we don't know all the things that we need to know. So if you are asked a question and you don't know the answer, and you just say, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that, or you can say, I don't know the answer to that. Can we have that, everyone? Can we have that as your assignment? Can we have that as your homework? Okay, so to throw it back to the class at gawin mong assignment para masustain yung kanilang curiosity. Okay, now, if you have a demo teaching, for example, nagka-demonstration teaching ka, and especially sometimes, pag nag-demo ka, tapos ang mga students mo sa demo ay teachers, sometimes they'd test you. So sometimes they'd ask you a question which they are sure you don't know what the answer is. Okay, so if that happens, if they put you in that situation, the best thing for you to do is to do the same thing. So you say, I'm so sorry, I don't know what the answer is to that question. I will give that question as the assignment to the entire class. We'll discuss the answer to that tomorrow. Okay, so that's one hint for you to have whenever you conduct your demo teaching. Alright, so letter C again is the answer for number 45. Now we go to number 46. The heredity traits acquired by a person in his lifetime, letter A, are transmissible to his offspring, letter B, reappear in his future grandparent, letter C, have no influence on the offspring, letter D, become recessive traits. The correct answer for this would be letter A. They are transmissible to his offspring. Ang ibig sabihin po ng offspring dito ay anak. Okay, so whatever trait you have acquired in your lifetime, those traits are going to be transmitted, those traits are going to be inherited by your offspring, by your anak. Okay, so natatransmit po siya sa inyong mga anak. Number 47, when students are given a chance to settle differences of opinion by discussion, they develop what? Is it A, fair play, B, tolerance, C, irritants, D, sociability? If you give them a chance to settle differences by opinion or of opinion by discussion, then you give them a chance to develop tolerance. Okay, so tolerance is the correct answer. Definition of tolerance is here, a fair and objective attitude toward those whose opinions, practices, race, religion, nationality, etc. differ from one's own. It's freedom from bigotry or freedom from discrimination. Okay, so tolerance is freedom from discrimination. We go to number 48, third to the last question. The school's responsibility towards teenagers' gang age is. Now, as we all know, if we are teaching teenagers or if we have kids who are in their teenage years, they'd always be in gangs, okay? It might not be something that is very bad. By gangs here, we mean grupo, okay? So, meron silang mga barkada, meron silang grupo, group of best friends, okay? So, as the school, what is our responsibility? Should we provide the gang all the freedom it needs? Should we give classroom activities to give direction to out-of-school youth activities? Is it letter C, supervise gang activities? Okay, so pupunta ka sa kanilang gang war, for example, okay, supervise their gang activities. Or letter D, set up norms of conduct for the member of the gang. Okay, so magbibigay ka ng norms, magbibigay ka ng kanilang mga bylaws, okay? So the correct answer here would be letter B, give classroom activities to give direction to out-of-school youth activities. Okay, so do not give them a chance to na magkaroon ng maraming time na mabakante na walang ginagawa, okay? Or else magloloko yung mga bata, okay? So that's letter B. The correct answer for this would be letter B. Now, number 49, second to the last question. In an intelligence test, a 13-year-old girl got a score equivalent to that of a 15-year-old. This means, so yung age ng bata is 13 years. Okay? Ang nakuha niyang equivalent is that of a 15-year-old. Should it mean that the girl must be accelerated? That the girl is 2 years older mentally? The girl has a chronological age of 15. Again, chronological age is the actual age. Number or letter D, that she has a mental age of 13. Okay? So, sinasabi sa ating question, 13 years old ang bata, pero yung score niya, ang nakuha niyang score ay equivalent to that of a 15-year-old child. So, we cannot choose C. We don't say that the chronological age is 15. We also don't say that the mental age is 13. Dahil yung mental age nga is that of a 15-year-old. So, your correct answer would be letter B. The girl is 2 years older mentally. She is 13 years old, but her mental capacity is that of a 15-year-old. Okay, so that's letter B. Alright, now we get to the last question. Which statement is not necessary to achieve the learner's interest in a learning activity? Is it letter A, the activity must lead to a practical end? Letter B, the activity must be within the ability of the learner? Letter C, the activity must fill a need recognized by the learner? Letter D, the learner must have experience that will furnish the background for the activity. Okay, ano kaya yung correct answer natin dito? Saan dito yung hindi kailangan? Well, all of these are actually needed, but we are going to choose just the least needed. Okay, and the correct answer here would be letter A. The activity must lead to a practical end. Okay? It does not need to be presented that way. Hindi kailangang yung practical end niya ay nakikita na nung bata. Okay? So sometimes you just say that you can apply this in our future topics. You can apply this in your future subjects, for example, or you can apply this. If you learn this, then you'll have it easier once you get to college. Okay, so usually yun yung mga sinasabi natin pag hindi nakikita ng bata yung practical end. Okay, so the correct answer here would be letter A. Alright, so that ends our 50 questions. Now, I have actually prepared